Welcome to Historically Speaking, news and notes from the Westchester Township History Museum, located at 700 West Porter Avenue in Chesterton. The museum is a cultural and educational service of Westchester Public Library. I'm Serena Ard, curator of the museum. Welcome everyone, and thank you for listening today. Today we're going to take a look at Duneland's place in the history of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad has long intrigued historians, in part because of its secrecy, but also because of how large the system was and how well it really seemed to work. We are also going to discuss where the research is focusing in recent years. But first, let's take a look at some of the things happening at the museum. I do want to let everyone know that in the next month or so, the driveway entrance for the museum will be changing so that both entry and exit will take place on the west side of the building, and parking will only be available on the north side of the building. We will make an announcement when this happens, and we'll have signage in place to help everyone, but feel free to call us if you have any questions. I don't expect this to take place before the next Historically Speaking, but since I never know what to expect from construction, I'm giving you the heads up now. On Thursday, March 13th at 2 p.m., we will host Music at the Museum. Join the flashbacks as they perform music from the past 500 years from around the world. I imagine March's music might have an Irish focus, but I can never really be sure because they always surprise me. On Tuesday, March 25th at 7 p.m., join us for Irish Trivia Night. Test your knowledge of Irish and Irish American pop culture and history. Teams of 1 to 4 can vie for the prize. Doors open at 6:45 p.m. and seating is first come, first served. May the luck of the Irish be with you. If you have children ages 6 to 12 and need something for them to do during spring break, take a look at Cupcakes and Canvas on Monday or Tuesday, March 24 or 25 at either 10 a.m. or 2 p.m. Children are invited to paint a masterpiece and enjoy delicious cupcakes. No previous art experience is necessary and all supplies are provided. Participants should wear clothes that can get messy. A parent or guardian must accompany each child. You can register online or by phone for one session beginning Monday, March 10 at 9 a.m., and it is limited to children ages 6 to 12. So now let's take a look at the Underground Railroad in the Duneland area. The phrase Underground Railroad first appears in text in the 1830s, when men searching for freedom seekers claimed it seemed like they had just disappeared on some kind of underground railroad. It was a highly secretive system, making it very difficult to research. There is some solid evidence establishing locations as stops on the Underground Railroad, but many of the locations believed to be part of the Underground Railroad are actually part of local stories, anecdotes, and family legends. It is difficult, if not impossible, to actually prove that some of those are actual locations. So organizations like the National Park Service does accept anecdotal evidence as evidence for the Underground Railroad. Public memory is a very difficult thing, though. Most of our local histories don't even mention the Underground Railroad until after the first major books and interviews were done revealing the depth of how the system worked. These came out in the 1870s and later, and suddenly many people in the United States had been part of the Underground Railroad. This is the case for many of the Duneland stories. But there's a great quote from a New York minister and abolitionist from 1865. Thomas Jefferson Sawyer wrote, quote, "It is a very curious fact in the history of public opinion that the mass of people who never think or act with early reformers gradually come to persuade themselves, as the Reformation goes on and grows popular, that they were always of that party, or at least sympathized with its spirit. 20 years hence, there will not be a man in all the North who favored secession or cherished any sympathy with rebels. Even now, it is rare to meet one who has ever wished well to slavery or desired anything but its final abolition." And Sawyer was absolutely correct. 20 years after the Civil War's end, most Northerners would never claim to have sympathized with the South or for having favored slavery. It was the losing side, after all, and no one wants to be associated with the losing side of history. The same concept can be applied to the Underground Railroad. Although many people didn't know of its existence until well after slavery ended, many families came out and claimed a connection to the Underground Railroad. One of the things that makes it hard to research is the fact that it was so widespread and so many different people were involved with the Underground Railroad at very different times. The goal of the Underground Railroad was for freedom seekers to reach Canada or Florida. Now, I know a lot of you have not heard about Florida being part of the Underground Railroad, and it's a portion that's not often focused on, but for our purposes, we actually want to look at Canada. Most of the freedom seekers coming through the Duneland area were aiming for Canada, where slavery was abolished and they could be free. But to reach Canada, they first looked to reach either Detroit or Lake Michigan. It is believed the Underground Railroad started in the 1820s, but any activity in the Duneland area is questionable during this time. Why? Because the Duneland area was not populated year-round until white Americans settled here. It is accepted that several indigenous tribes aided freedom seekers, particularly since much of the land they needed to cross was still owned or occupied by indigenous people. Trails, rivers, and other travel routes were commonly known and used by Native people. Although their villages may not have been directly on those routes, they were nearby and may have offered a break or shelter to a freedom seeker after traveling for hundreds of miles. However, even indigenous people did not live in the dunes during the winter. The Potawatomi moved south to the Kankakee River, or northeast toward South Bend in Michigan. The dunes did not have much to offer in the way of food sources during this season, so for months on end, the dunes were relatively abandoned, and there was no help available for those on the Underground Railroad. However, once white settlement increased in northwest Indiana, activity on the Underground Railroad begins to take shape. First, Chicago incorporated as a town in 1833 and as a city in 1837. Michigan City was platted in 1832, and the lands around Michigan City came up for sale at that same time. As homes and businesses were established, there were real places that freedom seekers could hide while on their journey rather than being forced to hide within the dunes. Of the northwest Indiana counties, Porte County has the strongest and best documented history with the Underground Railroad. It's likely due to the fact that Porte County was organized before Porter or Lake counties. It could also be due to Michigan City's location on Lake Michigan, and therefore an appealing location to access a boat to take you to Michigan or Canada. Michigan City was also the first stop before you reached Michigan, and many of the towns in southwest Michigan, like Three Oaks, were well-known parts of the Underground Railroad. The Duneland area was a useful place for the Underground Railroad. We were home to many trails, crossroads, U.S. stage and mail roads, and waterways that led to Detroit or Canada. So what were these paths? Well, if we look to some of the early research into the Underground Railroad done by a man named Wilbur H. Siebert at the University of Ohio during the 1890s and early 1900s, we can find some maps that he drew with estimates of Underground Railroad paths. Maps depicting routes prior to 1848 generally don't show any paths through northwest Indiana. However, as Siebert continued his research, he shows that Old Sauk Trail through Dyer, Maryville, Valpo, and LaPorte as a major route, as well as either the Lakeshore or the Detroit-Chicago Road between Michigan City and Chicago. All of these paths were highly traveled routes with many businesses, homes, and potential stations available. One such station may have been a tavern owned by a man named Allenson Green. Allenson Green owned Green's Tavern at New City West along the Detroit-Chicago Road in the 1850s. At the time, tavern meant hotel or inn, a place where travelers could rest, get a meal, and change horses if needed. Allenson has long been named an abolitionist, so the idea that his tavern could have been a stop or helping point along the Underground Railroad is highly possible. As we begin to talk about places where freedom seekers could stop on the Underground Railroad, we need to remember the kind of places they stopped. Hiding inside a house was not as common as we might think. Was it done? Yes, of course. Barns were often a better option, in part because the owner could possibly have deniability if caught, as though they had no idea people were hiding in their barn. In addition, freedom seekers were unlikely to hide within a business establishment. They were not given rooms at a tavern. It would be too possible to be seen. Some freedom seekers literally hid within fields, using tall grasses and crops to hide them from passersby. They often traveled by foot for many, many miles, and if they were lucky, they could catch a ride on a wagon, hidden under tarps, blankets, and goods. Other fascinating methods of travel included the railroads. Northwest Indiana did not get railroads until 1852, when both the Michigan Central and Michigan Southern Railroads built tracks from Michigan City through the region to connect to Chicago. Both of those companies, as well as the New Albany and Salem Railroad, have been connected to the Underground Railroad in historical research. The New Albany and Salem line went from southern Indiana to Michigan City. Railroad companies would outfit special cars to include hidey holes, where freedom seekers would lay in a prone position while traveling. It was uncomfortable, bumpy, and probably very loud. Stories claim that women in railroad station towns would prepare large bundles of food and give them to the railroad workers to give to the freedom seekers. Henry Hageman, founder of the town of Hageman, which is today's town of Porter, has stories connecting him to the Underground Railroad through the proximity of his property to the railroad as well. Hageman's home was located on the site of today's Joe's Towing, right next to the railroad tracks. Hageman was not mentioned in connection with the Underground Railroad until 1950 that I've been able to find, but since then, the story has remained in circulation. Like I said earlier, it's difficult to find proof that any of these people were actually connected to the Underground Railroad, but the location of Hageman's property relative to the Michigan Southern Railroad tracks indicates a reasonable possibility. Other paths of travel for freedom seekers took them directly to Lake Michigan. In his Underground Railroad research, Siebert found mention of 3 different paths from southern Indiana to Lake Michigan, with boarding points on the lake within all 3 lakefront counties, Lake, Porter, and LaPorte. One story by Porte County historian William Briggs in the 1950s indicates a shipwreck near Ogden Dunes that may have been carrying freedom seekers to Canada. Some believe this to be evidence that Ogden Dunes was the Porter County point of access. However, it could have also been located further east, towards the state park, where a 300-foot pier was built by lumberman Lansing Morgan. Either way, the ship at Ogden Dunes reportedly was discovered with freedom seekers aboard and purposely sunk. Several other stories abound in Porter County, including a Mr. Norman Tanner at Moss Lake in Liberty Township, where Camp Lawrence is today. Another story claims that the Biggs family of Liberty Township did not serve as a stop, but did serve as kind of guide. As wagons with freedom seekers came through, they would tell the driver whether the coast was clear along that path to the lake by mentioning the weather. A beautiful day we're having could mean the coast was clear, while looks like a storm is brewing indicated that there were people out looking for freedom seekers and the driver needed to find a new route. One of the most common stories throughout the United States is that of the Quaker community. Charles Osborne is recognized as one of the founders of the Quakers' abolitionist leanings. He wrote many articles about abolishing slavery in his short-lived printing, The Philanthropist, in 1816. He wrote, quote, "The full enjoyment of liberty is the right of all without any previous conditions." The Society of Friends, which is the rightful name of the Quaker Church, actually split temporarily over the issue of anti-slavery. Famed abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison called Osborne the father of us abolitionists. Osborne was born in North Carolina in 1775, but moved to Tennessee, Ohio, Michigan, and then Porte County, Indiana. In the early 1800s, many Quakers left the South to move north in protest against slavery in their home states. In the 1840s, Osborne settled west of Clear Lake in the Porte County side of Westville, along with several other Quaker families like the Reynolds and the Barnards. It is believed that this Quaker community was active in the Underground Railroad as well. The secretive nature and positive role of the Underground Railroad in U.S. history makes it a favorite topic of research for many. Recent research shows a focus on the stories of the freedom seekers themselves rather than the participants of the Underground Railroad. For over a century, the focus of Underground Railroad research have been the white folks who helped rescue runaway slaves. Now, we are trying to look at the experience of seeking freedom from the South, their actual trials and tribulations, the journeys and the outcomes. It may be pleasant to think of how local residents may have aided those freedom seekers, but I can promise that the journey was long, arduous, and sometimes very painful, and sometimes deadly. Oftentimes, families were divided by those who reached freedom and those who did not or could not. Sometimes entire new communities formed, made up of freedom seekers set on helping other freedom seekers, like those communities in southern Michigan. If you would like to learn more about the Underground Railroad in Northwest Indiana, feel free to visit us at the Westchester Township History Museum. We are open Wednesdays, noon to 5 p.m., and the second and fourth Saturdays of the month from noon to 5 p.m. But we are available to researchers by appointment. Call us at 219-983-9715 or visit us to make an appointment. That's all I have for you today. I hope you can join us next month for Historically Speaking.